Welcome to another chapter in the build of the Wedgie. Designing a body for the car gives a great opportunity to think about aerodynamics. The Wedgie has a shovel nose, is wedge-shaped, has quite a wide body, and a radiator in the middle. That's an opportunity to think about interesting aerodynamics and how air flows over the car. It needs a body to keep the shit out, so it might as well do something useful as well. This is not a topic I know a lot about. The best comparison I can find is Formula Student, FSAE cars. These have roughly the same operating parameters as the Wedgie, although the Wedgie is bigger and more powerful and probably faster. Nevertheless, FSAE cars have got information in the public space, and I'll use what I can. This chart comes from a dissertation paper that I'll link in the comments below. Looking at the second and third rows, I'll be very happy if the Wedgie gets a coefficient of lift of minus 0.79 to minus 1.28. The Wedgie will have much more drag, of course. This is because the Wedgie's tall, blunt rear end will be a huge source of turbulence, low pressure and drag. While I don't have any experience with computerized fluid dynamics, I thought I'd give it a go and used an online program called Simscale, which has 10 free runs on its community plan and 3,000 hours of Simscale computing time, and all of this on your browser. Yahoo! The car is modelled in Rhino 2. Simscale demands that the body is completely watertight with no overlapping faces or fiddly small details or other mesh errors. Rhino showed that the body was a closed surface with no errors, but even then I couldn't export it in Rhino format to Simscale and had to export it as an STL file, which I put through at medium density, welded all of the surfaces and had an aspect ratio of 2. However, I cried tears of frustration when Simscale refused to accept the STL file cleanly. I put the STL file through Microsoft's 3D Builder, which found numerous faults and cleaned them up. And then, good news, Simscale accepted the STL and I could progress to the next stage of the CFD. I didn't vary the CFD setup very far from the Simscale standard settings. Simscale do provide a tutorial for modelling the flow around a car, and that was really helpful in the setup. The first task is to put the CAD model of the car in a flow field, a virtual wind tunnel. In this case, the flow field goes 20 metres behind the car, 5 metres in front, 5 on either side and 5 above. This is to make sure that the CFD gets plenty of chance to develop the flow around the car. I modelled an incompressible flow, given that the Wedgie is unlikely to go above Mach 0.3, and modelled at 30 metres per second, which is about 100 kilometres per hour. I was also able to model a moving road at 30 metres per second and rotating wheels at 125 radians per second. That's pretty quick rotation, but then these are pretty small wheels. CFD uses a mesh of cells within the flow field, and the mathematics of CFD are based on how one of those cells communicates with another. Thus, I had to mesh the flow field and mesh my CFD model. However, this proved quite tricky because Simscale kept failing on the mesh, given that my STL model still had self-intersecting surfaces. And this was despite my best efforts to clean it. The only way I could get a mesh in the end was to use an internal flow field, which still worked, but is perhaps a little dodgy. And I made up for its dodginess by having a very dense flow field, somewhere in the order of 12 million cells. This picture shows the increasing density of the mesh, with increasingly dense refinements closer and closer to the car. So, too many late nights, too much coffee, but a result. The curve of coefficients showed a convergence after about 400 seconds. That's good. That means the model is stable. And a coefficient of lift at 1,000 seconds of minus 0.94, coefficient of drag of 0.75. Let's see what that really means. First up, surface pressures. This is showing a range in pascals, minus 300 to plus 300. 300 pascals is about 30 kilograms force per square meter. On the top surface, red is high pressure or downward pressure. Green is about neutral. Dark blue is lift. You can see there's a lot of downward pressure on the shovel nose and somewhat patchy pressure across the top of the rear wing. But it's good to see low pressure underneath the car. Almost all of the floor of the car is a low pressure zone, particularly under the wing and entry to the floor area, and then at the back at the entry to the diffuser. Also, the outer edges of the wing are in low pressure. That means that the edges of the wing are effective, maybe not so much the middle. The flow diagram, just with flow down the center line of the car, shows the diffuser in action. I can also do a visualization of velocity flow with animations and flow lines. The velocity flow front to back of the car it is perhaps hard to interpret, but looking at it from the front, the vortices become apparent. There is some flow at the front from the outside flowing in under the floor. The rear vortices, the spiraling vortices at the back, are what you'd expect as the air goes from high pressure to low pressure. Interestingly though, there seems to be a flow up the side of the car towards the outside of the rear wing. There is fast flow under the car, which is driving the low pressure at the front of the car and then just in front of the diffuser. The diffuser can really be seen in action here. There is some leakage round the side of the car, which is entering the diffuser from the side, and the nose of the car or the sides of the car seem to be kicking up a flow which is really powering the outside of the rear wings. This still shot really shows the flow of air through the diffuser. The leakage coming in from the sides is not as bad as I thought, and in fact looks like it provides a flow of air which helps the low pressure zone. Okay, what does all this mean? The first thing is that the basic body shape of the wedgie is validated. It produces downforce in the order of a CL of minus 0.94, which is approximately at 30 meters per second, 109 kilograms of downforce. Cool. I also ran a number of other scenarios, including a fully refined full body wedgie, which produced a startling CL of minus 1.38 and at 30 meters per second, potentially kilograms downforce of 266 kgf. Wow. However, I realized in doing this that I was getting away from my principles of a light, easy-to-build car that could fit on a garden trailer. Hence, I went to the cycle guards model. Out of the scenarios I tested, the one I called clean came out best. The clean had cycle guards, rear diffuser, side air intakes, airflow through the vehicle and out relatively closed ducts at the rear of the car. At the front, an S1223 wing at an angle of attack of 11 degrees, a narrow shovel nose. At the rear, a wing S1223 again at the maximum regulation height of 840 millimeters and an angle of attack of 8 degrees. I ran a variety of scenarios for the cycle guard, including cutting back and removing bodywork around the rear vents, positioning the rear wing in different positions, adding on the suspension to see what parasitic drag would occur, and also a fail mode in which I took the body to a high degree of yaw as maximum roll that suspension would allow and a pitch up. In other words, a horrible situation in which the car was going nose up, sideways, and rolling over in the middle of a corner, just to see what this would do to the aerodynamic characteristics. And here's the table comparing scenarios and results. The clean has a coefficient of lift of minus 0.94, as I said before, and a fairly high drag factor of 0.75, which is comparable to a Lotus 7. And the drag factor goes up even higher to 0.84 when I add in various parasitic elements. It doesn't compare that favourably with an FSAE car, which has got a much lower level of drag, maybe a CD of 0.66. Well, I'll just have to console myself with a small frontal area and more horsepower. I've used all of my free runs in Simscale. They have gifted me 10 more runs, which let me do a lot more simulation and scenarios. Now, if I get more runs, I'll look more closely at the effectiveness of the rear wing. Until then, I'll build the car, test it on the track, and cross my fingers.